What moment in history that's hard to believe it actually happened? The time that Nero tried to kill his mother by putting her on a ship that was supposed to sink. Except it didn't work because she climbed onto a bed and floated back to the shore. To fix this, he sent a small group of soldiers to go meet her on the beach and stab her to death. When the English monarchy was restored in 1660, King Charles II ordered the posthumous execution of the members of parliament involved in his dad's execution who had died during the interregnum. Basically, he wasn't going to let the fact that the guys were dead get in the way of vengeance. He literally had them dug up, hung the corpses, and then beheaded them. I already posted once, but I got another one. There were still Japanese soldiers well into the 1970s who had no idea the World War II was over. Like, they just got left behind by the Navy and held out on isolated islands for decades. One guy in particular spent his time feuding with the Filipino police. Everyone tried to tell him the war was over, but he thought it was a bunch of propaganda. Word eventually got back to Japan, where they had to look up his commanding officer, who had since left the military for a career as a businessman, and fly him to the Philippines. Only after receiving a direct order from his commanding officer did the guy stand down. That time Emperor Napoleon escaped from the island he was imprisoned on after his army was finally defeated, snuck back into France under the nose of King Louis XVIII and literally every royal guard and roadblock from Marseille to Paris. Then when he was actually caught just outside of Paris, he managed to persuade the soldiers, who just so happened to be former Bonapartists, to escort him into Paris where he managed to successfully cause the king to flee, on top of raising a full army to wage war against Europe again. The only time in history an emperor took back an entire country just by waving his hat. The Newport sex scandal. If I recall correctly, this was shortly after World War I. There was an investigation launched to root out homosexuals in the Navy. The investigation was conducted by having undercover agents, have sex with men, and to report their findings in very vivid detail to the guys heading the investigation. No homo. Also, FDR was Secretary of the Navy at the time and signed off on the whole thing. President John Quincy Adams once sent an alligator to Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette had no idea what the frick to do with it, so he gave it back. According to The Last Battle by Cornelius Ryan, on the 1st of May, 1945, the day after Adolf Hitler committed suicide, General Hans Krebs was sent under a white flag to deliver a letter to General Vasily Chukov of the Red Army, containing surrender terms acceptable to Joseph Goebbels, then acting as Chancellor of Germany. Krebs had not announced that he was coming, taking Chukov by surprise. At that time, he was being interviewed by two war correspondents, Konstantin Simonov and Yevgeny Dolmatovsky, accompanied by musician Matvey Blanter, who wrote the internationally famous Katasha. When he was informed that Krebs was waiting for him outside, Chukov, wanting to speak to Krebs as soon as possible, while making sure the meeting would seem official, quickly gave the interviewers, who were dressed in uniform, medals so that they would act as his staff, not knowing what to do with Blanter. However, since he was dressed in civilian clothing, Chukov hastily shoved him into a cupboard and ordered him to keep quiet, which he managed to do for the duration of the meeting. Unfortunately, the meeting came to nothing, as the Soviets would accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Once the meeting is over, just as Krebs and his men are leaving with the bad news, Blanter passes out from lack of oxygen, and falls out of the cupboard onto the floor of the room right in front of them. There was a scene in the film Downfall showing the events of this meeting, but the scene was removed out of worry that it would not be taken seriously, even though it really happened. This is the type of crap the cool history teacher brings up in class. A Russian sculptor was commissioned to make a statue of Christopher Columbus as a gift for the Americans, kinda like the Statue of Liberty. After the painstaking process of making it and shipping it to America, the Americans essentially said no thanks and sent it back. So the sculptor cut off the head of the statue, sculpted a new one and called it a statue for Peter the Great. You can still see it in the Moscow. To add insult to injury, when Moscow offered the statue to St. Petersburg, some background. Peter the Great didn't like Moscow. He founded St. Petersburg and made it a new capital instead. St. Petersburg also said no thanks. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919. A storage tank at a factory in Boston burst, killing 21 people and injuring 150 more in a 35-mile-per-hour tidal wave of molasses. The Boston Massacre. When your boy Caesar was kidnapped by pirates and he laughed at them for low ransom and told them to raise it, then over the course of time it took the Romans to raise the money. Caesar developed something of a friendship with the pirates to the point where he was joining in with their games and exercises. When the ransom arrived, he handed it over to the pirates and was set free. With his freedom he returned to the pirate ship, which was still where he left it, took them as prisoners and then crucified them. You left out the part where he explicitly tells them he was going to do exactly what he did. The 335 years war between the Isles of Scilly and the Netherlands started in 1651 and ended in 1986 when a historian was trying to debunk the myth that the two were at war. He discovered that the two were in fact at war and didn't know it. This prompted the signing of a peace treaty to end the longest war to have 0 battles and no bloodshed. The Dutch more or less declared war and forgot about it. The Dutch ambassador joked that it must have been harrowing for the Scillians to know we could have attacked at any moment. A man formed his own church, with himself as the head, just because the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce for another wife. Dancing plague around the 14th and 17th centuries. Large groups of people dancing on the streets until they collapsed from exhaustion. It is so strange that is hard to believe. Then again in the 70s, that outbreak is more often referred to as disco. Can someone help me with this one? It was during the Civil War where a general actually found the battle plans of the enemy but was such a crappy general that he still lost. Rwanda. I still can't believe that I was in high school during one of the most well-planned and carried out genocidal massacres of the second half of the 20th century. Everyone watched it happen, and still we just went on with our lives. If you haven't seen Hotel Rwanda yet, watch it. Hotel Rwanda fricked me up for a while. The most respectful territory control that currently happens. Hans Island is a small island that is contested territory between Canada and Denmark. Every few months, a platoon from one of the nations goes to the island, takes down the other country's flag to put up their own, drinks a crate of booze left behind by the other army. They'll drop a crate of their own booze and then leave. If one day they meet face to face on that island, I hope they have a drinking contest. Viking Siege of Paris. Leader pretended he was dead and asked to be buried in Paris. The French let him in, he jumped out the coffin and opened the city gates to his army. Edit. Wasn't Paris, I believe it was an Italian town near Rome. Leader was Bjorn Ironside, not Ragnar. I think I saw this episode. I can't believe Richard Nixon issued an executive order in 1971 which imposed a 90-day freeze on all wages and prices in the United States in order to arrest price inflation. How did anyone believe that would be a good idea or think that it would even be possible to enforce such a policy? Whip inflation now. Every time I read about the Battle of Stalingrad I'm just astounded human beings went through that and how Russian victory was actually achieved. It annoys me that there's not more Hollywood films about the Eastern Front. It was the most bloody and most horrific theater of the war. Nothing else compares. There must be some insane heroics that writers could form into films, but it mostly goes forgotten. I forgot what year, but in the Renaissance era, 2 massive Austrian armies mistakenly attacked each other. 10,000 men were lost. Just how many times nuclear war was avoided during the Cold War because one person, despite their orders protocol being to push the big red button, thought yay, no, I would prefer not to be the person who pushes the button that causes human extinction. I have enough crap on my conscience as it is. An illiterate 14-year-old French farm girl claimed to see visions and hear the voice of God, so she enlisted in the French army and led them to miraculous victories, until she was condemned for heresy and burned at the stake. Later, she was canonized as a saint. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest. So there's this Germanic chieftain, Murderous, and as punishment for fighting Rome, the Romans took his son Arminius and attempted to turn him into one of them. He was raised by a Roman family, given a Roman military education, and ended up as an officer in a force under General Publius Quinctilius Varus. In the meantime, Murderous dies, so his son is by all rights the chieftain of this tribe. Varus was sent to Germany to fight Arminius' tribe, and, wouldn't you know it, Arminius disappears one night. In the morning, the army moves off through the forest, and, shockingly, gets ambushed by Arminius and an army of angry Germans, who wipe out Varus' army. Varus himself commits suicide to avoid facing punishment for this disaster, and Rome never tried to take territory on that side of the Rhine ever again. Varus, give me back my legions. As a former soldier in the UK Army, for me it's the Northern Ireland peace process. I served a tour of South Armagh in 1986 and I could never see peace happening. So it's huge compliments to all involved in bringing peace. One of my uncles left Derry in the 1970s while my other uncle stayed throughout the Troubles. They always mention how they never thought they'd be able to see each other again, and now it's pretty easy. Crazy how decades of violence is not well known to most of the rest of the world, yet it impacted so many lives so significantly. The fact that Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe were both presidents when America was at war with pirates, and that no one has made a freaking movie about it yet. That crap would be CIEIEIC. Ridley Scott was planning to do a movie about the Barbary Wars called Trickery with Russell Crowe and Ben Kingsley, but it never ended up happening. That World War I started because a Serbian terrorist plot to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary failed miserably. When a terrorist threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, he forgot there was a 10-second delay and so it harmlessly bounced off the Archduke's car and exploded under the car behind him. The terrorist who threw the bomb then tried to swallow a cyanide capsule and drown himself in a river, but the river was only a few inches deep and the capsule just made him sick and so he was arrested. Then Ferdinand's driver got lost looking for the hospital so the Archduke could visit those injured in the attack, and during his search for the hospital went down a street that he had to slowly reverse out of. That street just happened to be the street where one of the terrorists decided to stop for lunch at a deli after his failed assassination plot, and so the terrorist whose group's initial attempt failed suddenly found himself 10 feet, literally, away from the Archduke and was able to kill both the Archduke and his wife with 2 shots from his gun which promptly jammed. The Archduke was hit in the jugular, his wife in the abdomen. All of this was done in the name of Serbian independence from Austria-Hungary and at the behest of Serbian military officers. Serbia then dissolved the group in 1916, 2 years after the start of the war, and executed its leaders. I have one. On the 10th of March, 1942, just over 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the Americans fled Java Island, but they inadvertently left behind 18 Americans. So a person called Master Sergeant Harry Hayes repaired a B-17 and, despite having no flight training before, let alone flown a plane, he successfully piloted the bomber, along with the other 17 Americans, to Australia, even without maps and instruments. Pretty close. Hayes didn't pilot the plane himself. A civilian pilot, who had briefly flown a B-17 before, and a Dutch officer were the pilot and co-pilot on the flight. The neat part though was they only had 3 good engines but still made the 8-hour flight to Australia with the last of the evacuees, including the civilian pilot's wife. Not being old enough to remember it happening, it's really difficult for me to imagine what it would be like if someone literally shot the US president. Like I can't even imagine seeing that news come across the wire. It seems like the biggest holy crap moment I can imagine. Honestly, with the unbridled hatred for the current and previous president from each side, I'm surprised that it hasn't happened at some point in the last 9 years. Remember that part in Braveheart where Wallace gets shot in the chest and not only survives but keeps fighting? The historical account actually says he got shot in the throat. The directors changed because duh. The Armenian Genocide and the whole death march. Even crazier because it only happened about 100 years ago. Like literally just 1.5 million people walking across a desert until they died of exhaustion or reached a concentration camp to die. Completely awful. Has to be one of the worst ways to die. Not to mention it wasn't really talked about at all for a very long time. And is still not officially recognized as an act of genocide by the US government. I'd like to redirect you to citation needed on YouTube by Tom Scott, which is, usually, about unbelievable things that happened in history. That the Berlin Wall came down and it didn't take a war, it just happened. Bit by bit, people pushed it a little bit, and authorities couldn't bring themselves to react, and that cycle repeated until the dam broke. From what I understand, an official was misunderstood on the radio and people thought it meant the wall was going to be taken down right away, so they flooded the streets and started the work themselves. Due to the confusion, those protecting the wall let it happen, and now it's gone. After being exiled, Napoleon returned to France in his 100 days. When he arrived, his former armies faced him. He exposed his chest and told them to shoot their emperor if they so wished. No one shot him up, so we got Waterloo to read about in the textbooks. And for hundreds of pages of Les Miserables. Nixon used to get blackout drunk and order tactical nuclear strikes, but his cabinet would delay the order until he sobered up. According to Kissinger, this happened like once a week. A guy manages to sneak up to Andrew Jackson with 2 pistols and tries to shoot him. Both his pistols misfire, despite that being statistically impossible, and Jackson realizes what just happened. Jackson proceeds to nearly beat the would-be assassin to death, and probably would have, if he hadn't been pulled apart from the man by several congressmen, including then incumbent Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett. The Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK had all his flag officers and half his cabinet pressuring him to attack the Soviet Union. He did agree that if the Soviets or Cubans attack the US, he would invade Cuba. There were armed tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the local commanders had authority to use them if they saw any US forces approaching the island. The US sent high-speed reconnaissance jets over Cuba to photograph the missile sites at low altitude. The Cubans fired on the aircraft, but they all returned safely home. When they landed, the Secretary of Defense was on hand and asked about the bullet holes in the aircraft. He was itching for a reason to invade Cuba. The lead pilot lied and said they were from bird strikes. They encountered no hostile fire. That was the point. That one moment when that pilot lied. If he had said we encountered some small arms fire, but no permanent damage, then the Secretary of Defense would have pushed to invade Cuba. If that had happened, the local strategic commanders would have engaged them with tactical nuclear weapons, and the US would most likely have retaliated with a full nuclear strike. That's how close we came to nuclear annihilation. There are a few other close calls that were saved by individuals, but for me this is the one because we were living in a powder keg and giving off sparks. That a Greek city-state practicing democracy managed to defeat an invading empire twice. Later on, some random 19-year-old would go on to conquer all of that empire in one shot, stopping at India. City-states, they tended to work together against the Persians. One drug lord basically controlled a country for a while, and there were people who still thought of him as a hero after doing horrendous things to his own people. The fall of the Soviet Union. I know it's very easy in retrospect to say, yeah, they were doomed. Growing up in the 70s and 80s, though, it wasn't so easy to see. We didn't know what they were doing, or why. All we knew was, they had 1,000s of missiles pointed at us. Even when Gorbachev instituted Perestroika and Glasnost as a way to reach détente with us, there was still a sense of secrets. That Iron Curtain didn't come down so easily. I remember when Chernobyl melted down, we knew it had happened about a week before they admitted it. It was picked up by satellites. That last coup, it was an utter shock. To have Yeltsin step forward and tell everyone he was president of Russia, I about fell out of my chair. The United States turned away a ship of Jewish refugees from Germany in 1939, and more than a quarter of them ended up dying in the Holocaust. In the middle of the 20th century, a first world country successfully pulled off a genocide, and they did it for years before anyone stopped them. It still boggles my mind. We were using televisions and launching rockets, and meanwhile 10 million were being systematically murdered. The Wright brothers were absolute geniuses. Some of the greatest minds of mankind. However, I find that not a lot of people mention the time that they found a rat in their kitchen and started to chase it around the shack with a gun. Well, there's a reason that they're not known for inventing a better mousetrap. When George Osborne sent a letter to the Dodge asking them not to prosecute HSBC for money laundering as it would affect the UK's economy, cementing that banks are too big to jail. I recently learned in history class that in World War I during trench warfare, the soldiers on both sides stopped fighting to celebrate Christmas by doing things like play football together. I don't know if it's true or not, but afterwards they didn't want to continue fighting because they became friends, so they were replaced with different soldiers. You've all seen Troy, right? Well, in reality when the Greeks set off to go to Troy and wage war to it, they had no idea where it was exactly. They just knew it was a big city to the east that was a central hub for trading, etc. They actually laid siege for a whole year to the wrong freaking city before finding out where Troy was. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.